little bit of a jump edit there because I just had a app open and shut off my camera. So back to it. Mediterranean hilt. There. What a smooth transition. This is the Del 10 Falcata. Now, Del 10, when they stopped dealing with museum replicas some years back, and Windlass bought out museum replicas, they now do a version of this. I have not seen theirs. I don't remember who it was who reviewed one. Somebody did. Maybe Thomas and Medieval Review back in the day had one. You can see there's a Del 10 crest, and I think it may say Del 10 on the other side. Let's see. Where does it say it? I can't get that in focus. I think right, maybe there. Yes, there. There we can barely see it. It says Del 10. And I think the Del 10 probably is a little better quality. I don't know. Back in the day, Del 10 swords were, I think, a bit better constructed than Windlass. But in comparison to the two hilts, I said this is more Mediterranean-ish. The Falcata is actually probably Iberian and was used by the Celts, whereas the Copus was used by the Greeks and usually just was thinner in the blade, not quite as beefy. From what I've seen, I'm no expert, but you see that's more with the downward loops here and here. It's a little more Mediterranean. You may notice this little block here. I don't know why they left that there at the end of the handle, but my guess was that if you have this and you drop it, it hits the metal and doesn't damage the wood. That's my only guess. It's just protectant to make sure you don't damage your handle. All I can figure, because it doesn't make sense why they left just a square chunk there and did such a good job of, putting the jimping here and stuff. So that's my guess. But back to the Falcata. It is, in fact, peened there. You can see the difference in the metal. It's quite hefty. The brass adds a lot of weight, but even so, this blade has a lot of heft to it. Of course, it is very much like a kukri in that it's a major chopper. Some people think, or there's a rumor, I don't know if it's true, but there's a historical rumor that the metal reinforcings on a Roman's helmet were to prevent that, because these were so good at caving in the helmets. I think most of us realize that sword's probably not going to cut a helmet, but certainly dent the hell out of it. Okay, so let's measure the blade on this. Now, some people would say this being the time period from... let me do this backwards.
I'm coming for you.
Being as a Greek sword would be considered a sword, because Greek swords tend to be shorter, but we're judging by modern context, and that is 20 inches. So, I just lost my ruler. We will say that it's definitely a Demi-Sword, but quite a hefty one. Of course, if you notice, when I hold the sword like this, the handle has this offset, so your pinky, so you're actually gripping it, as I've seen in pictures like this, kind of handshake grip, which puts the point actually in line. Despite being a curved sword, the way you hold it, you actually have the thrust lined up. So these were probably, I would think, used for thrusting also. I seriously doubt they were just chopping. That's their main function, but given that they line up so beautifully with that point when you hold them properly, if you can see, I think that was intentional. But there is no guard on this, so best used with a shield. Moving on. I have no idea who made this one. Haha. This is my one and only Filipino blade. It used to not be mine. I bought it for my friend Angie. She's Filipino. And she sold it to me recently because she needed money. I probably will give it back to her, and I hope she doesn't watch this video and know that. But, she was considering selling it to somebody else because she was desperately in need of some cash. I couldn't loan it to her. And I didn't want her to lose the blade. Why? Well, I don't know this blade style's name, and this is not quite as, I don't know if this is traditional, but most Filipino handles tend to curl back more. But it's a simple blade. Similar, actually, very similar to the Falcata, but straight instead of sloping forward. Generically, this is called a bolo, and ironically, Cold Steel this year put out one very similar, a little fancier with a little more traditional hilt that has kind of a head at the end, bit longer blade that they call bolo. Bolo, I think, is just generic for knife, as I've kind of understood it, and so some of them have specific names, like the panabas and various other things. I don't remember all the names. I'm not very knowledgeable about it, but generically a bolo. And it's not good for fighting in terms of stabbing. It's fine for cutting because it does have that swell, and it cuts pretty well for its size. But that little tiny ass guard there doesn't block your hand very much. How do I know this? I tried to stab something once like an idiot. And you can't really see it, but I cut myself across my finger here. It was probably about 2.5 years ago, and I still haven't gotten all the sensation back in my fingertip because it cut me down to the bone and kind of hit the nerve. So, proof that this guard is not enough to keep your hand from going up the hilt on a stab just when you're holding it. So, no, not good for thrusting this version. But I have seen some that have bigger guards, so just depends. But this is more a jungle knife that would be secondarily a weapon, I would assume. I don't know. I don't know enough about Filipino knives to know how much of a combat versus utilitarian knife this is, but let's take it as assuming it is a combat knife, right? So, as such, how long is the blade on it? Oh, look at that. Dun, dun. Oh, can we get that? I'm scared of this thing. It's so fucking sharp. Yeah, obviously it's damaged my finger. I know it's dangerously sharp. Okay, so right there, we see that is 16 inches. 16. Well, that's still above my 15 cutoff for a dagger, just barely. So this is a rather short demi-sword, but certainly, especially with that added weight, and it's got a little bit of heft to it. I really like that little swell there. One thing I like with swords is when I'm cutting to at the last second, pull the pinky in. Kind of like when you're casting like a fishing rod. Sometimes you do that with your, you know. And I think that has that last little second of chop, and that little upswept there just really makes it feel right to, you know, hack into something. So I really like that. I added, I don't know if you can see a little bit of leather right here, 2 strips on each side of the scabbard, because it wasn't having much edge retention. I mean, not edge retention, scabbard retention. So I added those in. It still glides in rather smoothly. It's a little, but it adds friction so it doesn't come out. Next, one of my favorites, one of the ones I carry with me. In Georgia, they revised the laws recently, a couple years ago, where any blade 12 inches and under, you do not need a permit for, concealed or open, apparently. Anything over that, you do. I have a weapon carry permit, mostly because I collect swords, and sometimes people say, hey, bring your sword over, I want to see it. I just don't want any legal trouble with it. I usually don't carry huge knives. Now, this one I sometimes carry with me in my car, but it's not a knife I generally carry with me if I'm going out of the car, you know. But as a backup, ooh, that looks like kind of like some early saber hilts. Very wide knuckly guard. It is a Confederate style deep guard buoy. It's the windlass version, and although the guard, it's debatable as to whether that shape is quite right. The knob here, I think, is wrong. Most ones I've seen either just have a curling up, sometimes very much longer, like a Chinese butterfly sword, but usually it's a flat kind of scroll look to it rather than being an actual bulb there. I don't think I've seen many that way. But with Confederate knives, the big ones they carried, you sometimes see double-edged blades on them, sometimes with a saber hilt, sometimes a hilt like this, sometimes even just a hilt more similar to this. This, in fact, almost would be a Confederate knife in its design. I've seen some with cabbage cutter hilts, not the actual blades, I don't think. I think they're a little bit different. But nonetheless, they're pretty big. Now, this one's fairly light, but it has a bit of authority to it, and, of course, that point is pretty much in line. So it's slightly offset. I don't know if you'll be able to see that very well, because it's slightly upswept, but it doesn't really matter. The false edge on here is sharp, and you could do a technically flip over like that and still catch it with the point over, you know, kind of thing. Anyway, that is one I usually have with me in my car for backup. Now, it really looks like it goes woo-woo, but it doesn't. It's straight. Isn't that weird? Look down there, you see it's straight. Optical illusion. Huh. Oh well. Anyway, how long's its blade? Oh, look at that. That's 17, that would be 18. So just under 18 inches. Definitely a demi-sword. And very much, I think it gives itself to lend that name, because when a lot of people see this, they're like, oh, is it a pirate cutlass? No, it's actually shorter than cutlasses. Now, this isn't a cutlass, it's the briquette, but the reason I brought this in was this is essentially what many early cutlasses were like. Blades similar to this, sometimes wider, but similar kind of hilt. So this is very similar to what would be considered a cutlass. This might be called a hanger in England, and essentially be the infantry version of the naval cutlass, from what I understand. But essentially the same kind of length, same basic kind of sword. So if we compare those, they're very similar in the hilt. This one having a wood handle, this will be all brass, but very similar kind of designs. But well, let's do it this way. We're getting them all in the frame. There we go. You can see, much shorter for the Confederate D-guard. Now this is also very similar to, blades slightly different, but very similar in many ways to the Chinese butterfly swords that are usually used in pairs. These were, of course, kept single, but a very similar concept, and something in the butterfly swords I would also consider demi-sword. So, clearly, not all mine are historic, but they're similar, and some of the blades are sort of like, this is a cabbage cutter replica, and that's how big cabbage cutters were. So, although there's debate on how much they were used, but the Filipinos do use knives like that, even went to war with them. And it may have been a tool primarily and secondarily a weapon, but in the case of these, there's some debate as to how much the Confederates used them. Certainly, once rifling came in the Civil War, there was less need for melee combat, and many Confederate soldiers stopped carrying them altogether for sure. But even if you weren't using this as a weapon, it could be a weapon, obviously. You could use it as a machete, butcher a hog with it, cut some camp wood, and when you shot your shot, if you didn't have a bayonet or didn't like your bayonet, you could drop your rifle and get this thing. It's a short sword machete. So a demi-sword, right? That's what I'm getting at. Now, why is this length important? This 17 to 20 inches. Because it doesn't just show up in swords. Here I have a replica of a mace. I think it's a German mace. One that has a slight guard. Many maces don't. This one does. That's one reason I liked it. It's a solid shaft. Most maces had hollow shafts and were a bit lighter than this one was, but this was a solid shaft. It's pretty much indestructible. Old windlass model. It looks very similar to the Arms and Armor model of mace in the head. It's a little bit different. Some of the more recent windlass maces apparently do have hollow handles, and Skalagram bent his by hitting it wrong. So, despite the extra weight, I think mine's better because it doesn't break. Anyway, my major point is that if you have a weapon like this, it's fairly short compared to a sword. You know? And if this is supposed to be an anti-armor weapon, and swords are much longer, why this length? I mean, here's another type of mace, an earlier mace. This is actually brass head, but it's similar. It's basically like some of the bronze-headed maces. You see, they're the same length from where you hold them to the head. So what is that length we're getting at? Well, if we put this at the guard, I don't have to worry about cutting myself now. So get this at the guard. Go here to about where the flange is. Oops, I did that backwards. Now the ruler's backwards somehow. I don't know how I did that. Anyway, we get 14.5 inches from here to here, okay? But going back to the short sword, we're not cutting with the tip necessarily. We could cut out that far, but let's look to the point of percussion. Where is the point of percussion on this sword? Well, if we go a few inches back from the tip, say right about here from the tip, we get, what is that? About it's about 19 inches, right? 19. Okay. And let's say Confederate D-guard. Where do we get at with that? From where the prime little cutting part would be, we get back to about 14 inches. So you got to cut the length down because you're not necessarily cutting all the way out to the tip. Some might cut further to the tip now, but we're still getting a range of maybe 14 to 18 inches between where your hand is and where you're hitting or cutting. And this is for a lot of weapons around the world. If you look around, you'll see not just cutting implements, but especially maces in many places, or, axes. I did have an axe I was going to bring out, and I forgot to. But I made myself essentially, not from scratch, but from parts. Hang on, I'll actually get that. Wow, that was incredibly dramatic sounding. This axe, which is essentially a horseman style axe. Now, the head of this I bought, it was originally part of an axe I bought from Bud K. I bought it to be decorative because I like the style. I hit one thing with it, the shaft bent, so I said, that's no good. So I took the head, I retreated the edge and the back point with a map gas torch, made a new grip. This little part here is one of 3 parts that I got from an old dish hilt rapier. Sorry, I had to burp. This is actually the top. Now, axes like this usually had a round disc here and a round disc here. I didn't have another round disc, so I used a pommel. And this pommel is actually the top off a paper towel holder, the vertical ones with a screw on. Go looking for those. They have some great pommels sometimes. Handle I made myself. I kind of made it scoop flat, but rounded off. And basically what I did was just use part of the shaft, and I wrapped some cord around it, and then add 2 pieces of wooden dowel, small square dowels with edges, to help you edge line, and then wrapped it with some basic flat I think it was cloth, maybe suede, kind of suede cloth anyway. And the shaft itself is actually just a golf club shaft that I cut the head and handle off of, and I put a thumbtack in the top to make it not hollow looking, so it looks more authentic. But I've hit trees with it now, and it holds up very well. I've even put the spike through a metal pan before, and it's held up. Now, it's a little bit longer. Arms and Armor sells one of these. There's been some other companies that have over the years. Theirs is a little shorter, but even so, oh yeah, the balance point on this for an axe, this is kind of crazy. I want it being right about here. Now, this axe feels like a sword in the hand. I mean, it's incredibly light and incredibly fast. So that may be partly because that pommel's pretty heavy, but a lot of people are impressed with this axe for its lightness compared to how they expect an axe to feel. But anyway, from here, let me do this backwards. Got it backwards again. From here to where, from the guard, oh, Lord, I'm not doing very well in my eyelids, am I? From the guard up to here, oh, look at that, 17 inches to where the middle of the blade would be. So that length is important, about 14 to 17 inches of range from the hand to where you're going to hit. Like, let's see, in that range. This mace is a little bit shorter now. I think the axe Armor sells is closer to this one in length, so still in that range. It's where most Demi-Swords fall. Some short swords have their sweet spot in that spot and may have their, may have a longer blade, but their sweet spot's going to be in that range. Why? Well, because quite honestly, I think that's very useful range for many applications. For the Filipinos, maybe it's just a useful length to carry around on you as an everyday jungle tool. For the mace and weapons like axes of the medieval period, well, that's the range you're going to be at if you're in foot combat, perhaps. Perhaps that's how close you're going to be to nail someone in the head with a weapon like this. To make it longer might be Henderson's, but you say, hey, swords are longer. Yeah, they are. But the difference with a sword is you often half sword when fighting armor, and you're not using it at full range. The full range may be on horseback if it's a single-handed sword, or even with a long sword in single combat. But when you're pressed in a melee, 14 to 18 inches is about the range you're fighting at. Let that sink in for a while about how close that is, and start thinking about how many weapons have their cutting spot or thrusting point in that range. And you start to realize that despite the fact that many curators of museums and historians and others have glossed over weapons, especially edge weapons, in that range that I would consider Demi-Swords, they're a huge part of history, a huge part of culture, and obviously a very useful length when it comes to various things like, well, with the Cinque Deas of Italy in street fighting, or the Filipinos for jungle fighting, or in armor for how close you are in a melee. That's the length that I think many people don't deal enough with in their training or in examining weapons and what the reality of combat is in various situations. Sure, longer swords are especially better in one-on-one. Spears are better if you have two opposing armies at a distance. But when you all get close in and everything goes to hell, it's this short. Hilson, folks. Good night.